Every leader knows that a thriving organization depends on the energy, productivity, and commitment of its people. But few leaders are able to cultivate the employee engagement and performance needed for this level of success. What's the difference? Positive leadership practices. Welcome to the Positive Leadership Movement Podcast with your host, positive work culture expert, Alex Bratty. Ready to harness the power of positive leadership? Let's dive right in.
Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the Positive Leadership Movement. I'm your host, Alex Bratty, and in this episode, you're going to discover exactly how you can create a more positive culture in your organization so that your employees and your whole company is flourishing. Because, hey, it's one thing for you to be a positive leader. It's a whole other ball of wax to bring the entire organization into alignment with this positive leadership approach. And most importantly, we're also going to talk about how to overcome any resistance to culture change, because we all know that change can be really hard, especially if your organization has tried something like this before and it didn't really work. All right, so let's dive right in because there's a lot to cover. And let's start right at the beginning with what we mean by culture, and more specifically by positive culture. All right, so culture is essentially how people think and behave in your organization. Now, there are implicit assumptions in culture, right? And these are basically the unwritten rules, if you like, for the organization's foundational principles or beliefs. There are also social norms of how people interact and treat others. There is the tangible evidence of the organization's culture, such as logos, mission statements, how people dress for work. And then there are the explicit behaviors of the people in the organization. You know, what language do they use? How are relationships created and maintained? That type of thing. And so the bottom line is that culture is made up of several elements, and it's implicitly and explicitly embedded into your organization. And the really interesting aspect of this is that sometimes an organization may not even recognize what their culture is. They may not even know their own culture. And sometimes this is because members of the organization are just so ensconced within the culture, within the beliefs and behaviors of the culture, that they don't even recognize it's there, right? It's almost like they're wearing tinted spectacles without realizing the tint is there, right? But all that changes, right? Not recognizing culture can change rapidly when you try to shift an organization's culture, because suddenly the existing culture goes from practically invisible to very much top of mind for everyone because, hey, guess what? It's being changed, right? It's kind of like when you don't notice that your car is running just fine, right? You only notice when it's not running okay and it needs some repair or maintenance. Now it has your attention. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, Alex, and maybe my organizational culture is just fine. So why would I change it and go through this culture shift and deal with all that entails? Well, it's really simple. Yes, you and your organization may be doing fine, but is it reaching its absolute potential? Is it flourishing? Is it operating at levels of extraordinary excellence? Now, you might answer yes to that, but usually when I answer this question, the answer is no. And so that's why we want to make this culture shift, to create a positive work culture, because it takes your people and your organization from good to extraordinary levels of performance. And even if your organization is struggling with performance or culture, then this culture shift is even more important, because we know from years of research that positive work cultures absolutely perform at significantly higher levels than those who don't use this approach. Okay, so that said, how do we actually affect this type of organizational-wide change? Well, let's consider a case study. Let me tell you a story. So back in the 1980s, General Motors, or GM, had an auto plant in Fremont, California that was basically an organizational performance and culture disaster, okay? Absenteeism was at 20%. Yes, 20%. There were about 5,000 grievances filed by workers every year, which, by the way, was about the same number of employees at the plant. Workers were regularly walking off the job a few times a year. And yeah, with all of that, it's probably no surprise that productivity, sales, quality, and customer service, all those metrics were in the tank. So what did GM do? Well, they closed it down and they laid everyone off because they couldn't find a solution. But GM did recognize they had a culture issue on their hands, right? And so they did want to address this. And in an effort to do that, they went to Toyota and asked them to work with GM and introduce Toyota's lean manufacturing process. And they chose that Fremont location for it. Okay. Now, Toyota is known for this. Just a quick history here. Toyota is known for this lean manufacturing process, and they've actually exported it to multiple countries. But back then, in the early 80s, this was really cutting edge. And so Toyota kind of leapt at the opportunity to do this. And so it was really a beneficial relationship for both GM and Toyota. Okay. So what happened? Well, the plant reopened 18 months later, and 2 years after that, there were no strikes, absenteeism dropped to 2%, productivity, sales, quality, and customer service, all those metrics that were in the tank were now soaring sky high, all because of the culture change. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's probably this, right? Because I would be if I were in your shoes. Yeah, it can't have been as simple or as easy as that, right? Like that just sounded like someone waved a magic wand and suddenly we had terrible results and we transformed them into amazing, extraordinary results. And to some extent, you're right. It's not as simple or as easy as that. There's no doubt that this was a massive cultural shift. And I mean, consider this, which was described by John Schuch, who was one of the consultants to this project. When he assessed some of the plants of the big three auto manufacturers back then, he found that a worker on the assembly line could literally do nothing if he spotted a problem with one of the cars. So imagine this. The worker is there, he sees the problem, but the car would move to the next point on the assembly line. And the only option available to him was to hit a button that stopped the entire assembly line and temporarily shut down all operations. And you can imagine that doing that, not particularly well received by the bosses, right? So here's a worker who sees a problem, wants to report it, and he has no good way to do it. So what does he do? He just lets the car go by. Because, does he really want to take the flack for shutting down the entire assembly line? No, he doesn't. So he lets the car go by, and over time, guess what? People stop caring. That was the culture. And so is it any wonder that the workers were not invested in the quality of their work and that the quality was just so low, right? Now, contrast this with how Toyota processed the same situation, right? So first off, every employee was encouraged to look for mistakes and ways to improve their work product. That's a noticeable difference right there, okay? They were giving the employees ownership over the quality of this product. They were giving them the responsibility to look for problems. But here's where it gets really, really smart. Toyota had a specific stop the line procedure and they expected and wanted it to be used. Their philosophy was that there are always problems. How are we all working together to fix them? In fact, Toyota would get sort of hinked out, right? The managers at Toyota at this Fremont plant would get hinked out if the workers would say to them, oh, no problem, which of course is a very American cultural thing to do, right? Is to say, oh, there's no problem, we'll figure it out. They're like, no, there's always a problem. We want to know when there are problems. So right there, that's a huge difference in culture as well, right? So here's how their stop the line procedure worked. So let's say same worker sees the problem. In Toyota's system, he would hit the stop the line button. And what that would do is it would prompt his line boss to come and appear where he was at within a minute, right? Just a few minutes. So the line boss would appear within just a few minutes to assess the issue. If it was deemed a problem, he would then hit the stop the line button, and that particular car would be halted at a fixed point on the assembly line. So it didn't mean that all production shut down. The assembly line was built with these fixed points for stoppage specifically for this purpose that, hey, we're going to have problems. We need a way to stop the line without stopping the whole line. Now, what do you think of these two scenarios? Do you think the employees had a reason to care in the big three system and culture where they couldn't stop the line without getting into, a boatload of grief from the bosses because they stopped the entire assembly line? Of course not. They were powerless, right? Do you think they had a reason to care in the Fremont plant once the Toyota system was implemented? Oh, yeah. And in fact, Kim Cameron, who I've mentioned several times on this podcast, he's one of the premier researchers on positive leadership, and he's devoted a whole chapter of his book, Practicing Positive Leadership, to this topic of creating a positive culture. He described how employees were allowed to also choose their own job title. They were given business cards, everybody had a business card, as a demonstration of their value and importance in this new positive culture that Toyota and GM were creating together. And so this is one of the key learnings that John Shook, that consultant, talked about that he witnessed in all of this, is that by changing what people do, you can ultimately change how they think. You see, and this is a crucial point because very often people think that the way to change culture is to change hearts and minds first, and then behavior will follow. The Toyota case study and other research has shown that actually it's more effective and easier to change culture if you change what people do first, and then their hearts and minds will follow, right? And in fact, Cameron described how one of the Fremont plant workers said that when he would see one of the plant's cars when he was out and about, so he said, when I was at like a football game and I see a car that I know we produce, he would leave his business card on the car with a handwritten note in the back saying, "I made your car. Any problems, call me." And he said he did it because he truly felt personally responsible for his product. Wow. Now, if that isn't taking pride and being invested in your work, I don't know what is. And if this isn't a culture shift from feeling powerless to feeling a sense of ownership, I also don't know what is. So not only were the employees happier and more motivated in their work at this new plant once Toyota and GM joined forces, but it translated into higher performance and profits for GM. And really, it's hard to think of a more difficult culture shift than that one. It was a complete 180-degree change in how people behaved, thought, and felt about their work. All right, so based on that, we now know that no matter how terrible the culture may be, it is possible to turn it around and create an organization that is flourishing. So how exactly do we do this? All right, well, there are several steps to it. And in this episode, we're going to cover just two of them because I don't want to jam too much into an episode. I want to give us enough time to go through these. So we're going to do two of them now. And then in episode 9, we're going to cover the other 3. So there's basically 5 steps. We're going to cover the first 2. The first one is you got to prepare your organization for the culture shift so that they're ready for it, right? They're ready to take on this new culture. And the second step is handling resistance to the change because it's inevitable. Some people aren't going to be happy with the new approach, at least at first, right? I mean, as humans, we just don't love change. I mean, that's the bottom line. So it's going to happen. You're going to be met with resistance. All right, so preparing your organization for a culture change. Kim Cameron's work tells us that there are a couple of ways to do this, right? So one method is to do some comparison shopping. And what we mean by this is to evaluate your current performance levels with the highest levels you can find, right? So for example, maybe you compare your organization to your best competitors. Maybe you compare to goals you've already created for your organization. You could compare to past improvements or absolute ideal levels of perfection that you aspire to. Or you could compare how you're doing with the expectations of your employees, your customers, your shareholders. I mean, you get my point here, right? There are several ways you can benchmark your organization for where it's at now and where you want it to be. And doing this paves the way for a culture change because now people see what's possible and they can create aspirational goals. And that opens the door for doing things differently to get there. All right, so that's one way. The second way you can prepare your organization for change is to watch the language and start to shift what people are saying and how they're characterizing what's happening in the organization. Now, you might think this is a little nuts or a little bit woo-woo, but I can assure you that there is an absolute ton of research to back this up. So for example, Martin Seligman, who is widely considered to be the father of positive psychology, he did a bunch of research on the language used by professional baseball team managers, So here's what he did. He had his research gather all the publicly available language used by MLB team managers during an entire season. And then they assessed whether it was related to team performance. Sure enough, it was. The team managers who used optimistic words to talk about their performance were more likely to win games than those who used pessimistic words. And that they could actually predict performance based on this language. Because what they did was, they did it all for another season, and they actually predicted like which teams are going to do better and which aren't based on what we know about how their managers talk, whether it's optimistically or pessimistically. And sure enough, they predicted it. So it's really powerful. And similarly, researchers Warren Bennis and Bert Nanas noted that the most accomplished leaders across multiple industries and walks of life do not use the word failure. Go figure. Instead, they use other words such as false start, stumble, temporary slowdown, miscue, right? Saying the same thing, but using different words. So yes, language matters, and the story you're telling yourself and that you're saying out loud every day matters. It may seem odd, but our words become reality. And so if your organization uses pessimistic language, it's time to start shifting that. It's time to start describing your situation more optimistically, okay? Now, another way this can prep your organization for change is how you refer to your employees and how you sort of label people and things in your organization. So for example, Disney has a central casting department instead of an HR department. And its employees are cast members. They wear costumes, not uniforms. The Ritz-Carlton addresses its employees as ladies and gentlemen. Other firms, and I've worked with some of these, describe their employees as members of the family, right? So think about that. How are you describing your employees to make them feel a sense of value and belonging? How are you describing other aspects of your business? The break room, the tasks, the customers. All of these could be given more creative and more positive labels, right? So that the language of the organization starts to change, right? Now, these are small pieces of the puzzle, but they are incredibly helpful in laying the groundwork for both you and your organization to create a more positive work culture. All right, now those are a couple of different ways to prepare for the positive culture. But now, what do you do when you run into resistance? Because let's be honest, you're gonna do that. So let's talk about that next, because it is virtually inevitable that you will be met with some resistance because some people will feel threatened. Structures may be changing, status might be affected, and with good reason, people may be fearful or even hostile to these changes that are being proposed, right? So your challenge as a positive leader is to navigate this resistance, and not just that, but transform it into fuel for the positive change. So how do we do that? Well, essentially, we have to do two key actions. Okay, the first is we've got to reduce the resistance to change, and the second is we got to build momentum around the driving force for change, right? So we got to reduce first, and then we got to build up on the positive, right? So to reduce the resistance, Cameron suggests 3 pretty well-known and proven techniques, right? And you may have heard of these before, but they're great reminders, right? So the first one, and so obvious, but often entirely missed, and then people scratch their heads and wonder why their culture change didn't work, right? The first one is you gotta involve the people with whom the change is gonna have the greatest impact, right? Essentially, you got to get buy-in from these people, right? Include them in the culture preparation. Ask them for their input. Make them feel valued in this change process, right? Second, look for areas of agreement between those who want the change and those who are resisting it, right? And we talked about this briefly in the last episode, in episode 7, when we were talking about supportive communication for how to deliver negative feedback, right? Is that when you can find common ground, when there's a disagreement, or in this case, maybe even a clash, right? A culture clash, it provides an opportunity for growth and forward momentum, right? That common ground can become a foundation upon which more can be built and both parties can move forward together. So that's second. And then the third way to overcome resistance is to reassure people of what is going to stay the same, okay? What is not changing? Because remember, there's so much uncertainty with change, right? And so we want to tell them what can they actually be certain of as this uncertainty is taking place, right? So essentially, you want to create a sense of security and give people some level of familiarity to hold on to, right? Like we all want a familiar touchstone in our lives. And especially at work, when things are being shaken up, we're not sure how it's going to affect us. We need to know that certain things are going to stay the same, and you got to communicate that, all right? So that's how to overcome the resistance. Get the buy-in, look for common ground, reassure people of what's going to stay the same. Now, once you've done that, it's time to create some momentum behind the change seekers, and here are the 3 actions you can take for this. So the first is to very clearly articulate all the good that will come from this change. Like, what are the benefits, right? Remember, in a situation like this, people are often asking 2 questions, even if they're not saying them out loud. They are thinking them internally, right? And the first one is, how does this personally affect me? And the second one is, what's in it for me, right? So how am I going to benefit? And you got to communicate this. Use prior examples of success for this, or whatever evidence you can present that the positive culture will lead to flourishing and a better experience for all, okay? So you've got to communicate those benefits. The second way to build momentum is to get, again, buy-in, right? And here you want to get it at the highest level, right? We all know that any type of change, I don't care how big or small, it ain't going to work unless the folks at the top are fully on board, right? So make sure that the leadership team is in sync. And then look for champions at various levels in the organization so that you can create coalitions, right? Create change coalitions and teams who can help essentially kind of seep the new culture into all parts of the organization, right? That's how you start to spread it. So the buy-in comes at the top first, but then you want to think about, okay, how do I seep it into the full organization? Where are my champions at different layers of the organization? And then finally, to create momentum, think about and identify the core set of values that is going to drive this change and the new culture. And you want to do this for a couple of reasons. The first reason is the research shows that people are more apt to follow leaders who are consistent in their values and beliefs. And second, we know that positive values and a positive culture creates that heliotropic effect. That helio what? Yes, remember that weird word from episode 2? Okay, so and if you didn't listen to episode 2, definitely go back and check it out, listen in, because in that episode we explain why positive leadership actually works. And it's because of this phenomenon called the heliotropic effect, which in a nutshell states that all living things seek the light and thrive when nurtured with the positive. So, knowing that when you create your positive culture values, people will be naturally drawn to follow leaders who espouse and offer this positive value-based environment. So there you go. Woo! We covered a lot on today's episode. But I wanted to make sure we covered how to overcome resistance to change in the same episode as we covered preparing for change, because really, more often than not, I see that organizations stumble on culture change when they run into resistance, right? Either they get overwhelmed with the resistance and they essentially start backpedaling on the culture shift and it just simply doesn't happen, or they get overwhelmed with it and they just plow ahead anyway without addressing the resistance and just hope that, everybody's just going to have to be for what's going to happen. And, it's like it or lump it, basically, the attitude. And guess what? It doesn't work very well to do that, I got to tell you. And we don't want either of those outcomes for you or your organization. So that's why we're setting you up for success here, helping you to lay the groundwork for change and giving you the tools to navigate the resistance, coming out the other side stronger and with everyone moving in the same direction. So just to summarize what we've talked about today, first, you got to prep for the culture change. Do this by comparing your current performance standards with competitors, gold standards, stakeholder expectations, or aspirational and ideal goals, and start shifting the language of the organization so it's more optimistic, okay? Second, reduce the resistance to change by involving the people it's going to affect the most, identifying common ground, and reassuring people of what won't change. And then third, build momentum for the change by getting buy-in from the top of the organization and then trickling it down, communicating early and often on the benefits of the change, and establishing core values that are going to guide the change and the new culture. All right. Okay, so thank you for joining me for this week's Positive Leadership Movement episode as we really took a deep dive into how to start creating a truly positive culture in your organization. And join me next week because we're going to continue on this topic and discuss the next phase of your culture shift, right? Which includes creating an aspirational vision for the organization, developing commitment around that, and super, super, super importantly, how to maintain and sustain the change because, hey, we don't want to put in all this amazing effort for this to be just a fad that comes and goes at your organization. No, we want it to last so that you're reaping the benefits of a positive culture for many years to come. Alrighty, so join me next week for that. And as you may know, what I cover in these episodes is based entirely on what I hear from you, what you're asking about, what you're challenged with, what you want to know more about. So if you've got a question or comment about positive leadership, send me an email at questions@positiveleadershipmovement.com and I will answer your questions in a future episode. For now, this is Alex Bratty signing off and thanking you for being part of the positive leadership movement and inspiring me to do what I do every single day.
Make sure you subscribe to the show. If you like this episode, please rate and review. If you want to get more from Alex, check out Happiness at Work, where she provides leaders with a proven path to cultivate a positive work culture that increases performance, productivity, and profitability. Go to happinessatworknow.com. Join us next week and harness the power of positive leadership for your organization.